Certain aspects of the Admirable inquiry into the loss of the Titanic, 1912, in Notes on Life and Letters by Joseph Conrad. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Peter Dann. Notes on Life and Letters. Certain aspects of the Admirable inquiry into the loss of the Titanic, 1912. I have been taken to task by a friend of mine on the other side for my strictures on Senator Smith's investigation into the loss of the Titanic in the number of the English Review for May 1912. I will admit that the motives of the investigation may have been excellent, and probably were. My criticism bore mainly on matters of form, and also on the point of efficiency. In that respect I have nothing to retract. The senators of the Commission had absolutely no knowledge and no practice to guide them in the conduct of such an investigation, and this fact gave an air of unreality to their zealous exertions. I think that even in the United States there is some regret that this zeal of theirs was not tempered by a large dose of wisdom. It is fitting that people who rush with such ardour to the work of putting questions to men yet gasping from a narrow escape should have, I wouldn't say a tincture of technical information, but enough knowledge of the subject to direct the trend of their inquiry. The newspapers of two continents have noted the remarks of the President of the Senatorial Commission, with comments which I will not reproduce here, having a scant respect for the organs of public opinion, as they fondly believe themselves to be. The absolute value of their remarks was about as great as the value of the investigation they either mocked at or extolled. To the United States Senate I did not intend to be disrespectful. I have for that body, of which one hears mostly in connection with tariffs, as much reverence as the best of Americans. To manifest more or less would be an impertinence in a stranger. I have expressed myself with less reserve on our Board of Trade. That was done under the influence of warm feelings. We were all feeling warmly on the matter at that time. But at any rate our Board of Trade inquiry, conducted by an experienced president, discovered a very interesting fact on the very second day of its sitting. The fact that the watertight doors in the bulkheads of that wonder of naval architecture could be opened down below by any irresponsible person. Thus the famous closing apparatus on the bridge, paraded as a device of greater safety, with its attachments of warning bells, coloured lights, and all these pretties, was, in the case of this ship, little better than a technical farce. It is amusing, if anything connected with this stupid catastrophe can be amusing, to see the secretly crestfallen attitude of technicians. They are the high priests of the modern cult of perfected material and of mechanical appliances, and would fain forbid the profane from inquiring into its mysteries. We are the masters of progress, they say, and you should remain respectfully silent. And they take refuge behind their mathematics. I have the greatest regard for mathematics as an exercise of mind. It is the only manner of thinking which approaches the divine. But mere calculations, of which these men make so much, when unassisted by imagination, and when they have gained mastery over common sense, are the most deceptive exercises of intellect. 2 and 2 are 4, and 2 are 6. That is immutable. You may trust your soul to that, but you must be certain first of your quantities. I know how the strength of materials can be calculated away, and also the evidence of one's senses. For it is by some sort of calculation involving weights and levels that the technicians responsible for the Titanic persuaded themselves that a ship not divided by watertight compartments could be unsinkable. Because, you know, she was not divided. You and I and our little boys, when we want to divide, say, a box, take care to procure a piece of wood which will reach from the bottom to the lid. We know that if it does not reach all the way up, the box will not be divided into 2 compartments. It will only be partly divided. The Titanic was only partly divided. She was just sufficiently divided to drown some poor devils like rats in a trap. It is probable that they would have perished in any case, but it is a particularly horrible fate to die boxed up like this. Yes, she was sufficiently divided for that, but not sufficiently divided to prevent the water flowing over. Therefore, to a plain man who knows something of mathematics but is not bemused by calculations, she was, from the point of view of unsinkability, not divided at all. What would you say of people who would boast of a fireproof building, an hotel for instance, saying, "Oh, we have it divided by fireproof bulkheads, which would localize any outbreak"? And if you were to discover on closer inspection that these bulkheads closed no more than 2/3 of the openings they were meant to close, leaving above an open space through which draught, smoke and fire could rush from one end of the building to the other. And furthermore that those partitions, being too high to climb over, the people confined in each menaced compartment had to stay there and become asphyxiated or roasted, because no exits to the outside, say to the roof, had been provided. What would you think of the intelligence or candour of these advertising people? What would you think of them? And yet, apart from the obvious difference in the action of fire and water, the cases are essentially the same. It would strike you and me and our little boys, who are not engineers yet, that to approach, I won't say attain, somewhere near absolute safety, the divisions to keep out water should extend from the bottom right up to the uppermost deck of the hull. I repeat the hull, because there are above the hull the decks of the superstructures of which we need not take account. And further, as a provision of the commonest humanity, that each of these compartments should have a perfectly independent and free access to that uppermost deck, that is, into the open. Nothing less will do. Division by bulkheads that really divide, and free access to the deck from every watertight compartment. Then the responsible man, in the moment of danger and in the exercise of his judgment, could close all the doors of these watertight bulkheads by whatever clever contrivance has been invented for the purpose, without a qualm at the awful thought that he may be shutting up some of his fellow creatures in a death trap, that he may be sacrificing the lives of men who, down there, are sticking to the posts of duty, as the engine-room staffs of the merchant service have never failed to do. I know very well that the engineers of a ship in a moment of emergency are not quaking for their lives, but as far as I have known them, attend calmly to their duty. We must all die, but hang it all, a man ought to be given a chance, if not for his life, then at least to die decently. It's bad enough to have to stick down there when something disastrous is going on and any moment may be your last, but to be drowned shut up under deck is too bad. Some men of the Titanic died like that, it is to be feared. Compartmented, so to speak. Just think what it means. Nothing can approach the horror of that fate, except being buried alive in a cave, or in a mine, or in your family vault. So, once more, continuous bulkheads, a clear way of escape to the deck out of each watertight compartment, nothing less. And if specialists, the precious specialists of the sort that builds unsinkable ships, tell you that it cannot be done, don't you believe them. It can be done, and they are quite clever enough to do it too. The objections they will raise, however disguised in solemn mystery of technical phrases, will not be technical but commercial. I assure you that there is not much mystery about a ship of that sort. She is a tank. She is a tank ribbed, joisted, stayed, but she is no greater mystery than a tank. The Titanic was a tank 800 feet long, fitted as an hotel, with corridors, bedrooms, halls, and so on. Not a very mysterious arrangement, truly. And for the hazards of her existence I should think about as strong as a Huntley and Palmer biscuit tin. I make this comparison because Huntley and Palmer biscuit tins, being almost a national institution, are probably known to all my readers. Well, about that strong, and perhaps not quite so strong. Just look at the side of such a tin, and then think of a 50,000-ton ship, and try to imagine what the thickness of her plates should be to approach anywhere the relative solidity of that biscuit tin. In my varied and adventurous career I have been thrilled by the sight of a Huntley and Palmer biscuit tin kicked by a mule, sky high, as the saying is. It came back to earth smiling, with only a sort of dimple on one of its cheeks. A proportionately severe blow would have burst the side of the Titanic or any other triumph of modern naval architecture like brown paper, I am willing to bet. I am not saying this by way of disparagement. There is reason in things. You can't make a 50,000-ton ship as strong as a Huntley and Palmer biscuit tin. But there is also reason in the way one accepts facts, and I refuse to be awed by the size of a tank bigger than any other tank that ever went afloat to its doom. The people responsible for her, though disconcerted in their hearts by the exposure of that disaster, are giving themselves airs of superiority, priests of an oracle which has failed but still must remain the oracle. The assumption is that they are ministers of progress. But the mere increase of size is not progress. If it were, elephantiasis, which causes a man's legs to become as large as tree trunks, would be a sort of progress, where it is nothing but a very ugly disease. Yet directly this very disconcerting catastrophe happened, the servants of the silly oracle began to cry, "It's no use, you can't resist progress. The big ship has come to stay." Well, let her stay on then, in God's name, but she isn't a servant of progress in any sense. She is the servant of commercialism. For progress, if dealing with the problems of a material world, has some sort of moral aspect, if only, say, that of conquest, which has its distinct value since man is a conquering animal. But bigness is mere exaggeration. The men responsible for these big ships have been moved by considerations of profit to be made by the questionable means of pandering to an absurd and vulgar demand for banal luxury, the seaside hotel luxury. One even asks oneself whether there was such a demand. It is inconceivable to think that there are people who can't spend 5 days of their life without a suite of apartments, cafes, bands, and such like refined delights. I suspect that the public is not so very guilty in this matter. These things were pushed onto it in the usual course of trade competition. If tomorrow you were to take all these luxuries away, the public would still travel. I don't despair of mankind. I believe that if by some catastrophic miracle all ships of every kind were to disappear off the face of the waters, together with the means of replacing them, there would be found, before the end of the week, men, millionaires perhaps, cheerfully putting out to sea in bathtubs for a fresh start. We are all like that. This sort of spirit lives in mankind, still uncorrupted by the so-called refinements, the ingenuity of tradesmen, who look always for something new to sell, offers to the public. Let her stay, I mean the big ship, since she has come to stay. I only object to the attitude of the people who, having called her into being and having romanced, to speak politely, about her, assume a detached sort of superiority, goodness only knows why, and raise difficulties in the way of every suggestion, difficulties about boats, about bulkheads, about discipline, about davits, all sorts of difficulties. To most of them the only answer would be, "Where there's a will, there's a way," the most wise of proverbs. But some of these objections are really too stupid for anything. I shall try to give an instance of what I mean. This inquiry is admirably conducted. I am not alluding to the lawyers representing various interests, who are trying to earn their fees by casting all sorts of mean aspersions on the characters of all sorts of people not a bit worse than themselves. It is honest to give value for your wages, and the bravos of ancient Venice, who kept their stilettos in good order, and never failed to deliver the stab bargained for with their employers, considered themselves an honest body of professional men, no doubt. But they don't compel my admiration, whereas the conduct of this inquiry does. And as it is pretty certain to be attacked, I take this opportunity to deposit here my nickel of appreciation. Well, lately there came before it witnesses responsible for the designing of the ship. One of them was asked whether it would not be advisable to make each coal bunker of the ship a watertight compartment by means of a suitable door. The answer to such a question should have been certainly, for it is obvious to the simplest intelligence that the more watertight spaces you provide in a ship, consistently with having her workable, the nearer you approach safety. But instead of admitting the expediency of the suggestion, this witness at once raised an objection as to the possibility of closing tightly the door of a bunker on account of the slope of coal. This with the true expert's attitude of, "My dear man, you don't know what you are talking about." Now, would you believe that the objection put forward was absolutely futile? I don't know whether the distinguished president of the court perceived this. Very likely he did, though I don't suppose he was ever on terms of familiarity with a ship's bunker. But I have. I have been inside, and you may take it that what I say of them is correct. I don't wish to be wearisome to the benevolent reader, but I want to put his finger, so to speak, on the inanity of the objection raised by the expert. A bunker is an enclosed space for holding coals, generally located against the ship's side and having an opening, a doorway in fact, into the stokehold. Men called trimmers go in there, and by means of implements called slicers make the coal run through that opening onto the floor of the stokehold, where it is within reach of the stokers' firemen's shovels. This being so, you will easily understand that there is constantly a more or less thick layer of coal, generally shaped in a slope, lying in that doorway. And the objection of the expert was that because of this obstruction it would be impossible to close the watertight door, and therefore that the thing could not be done. And that objection was inane. A watertight door in a bulkhead may be defined as a metal plate which is made to close a given opening by some mechanical means. And if there were a law of Medes and Persians that a watertight door should always slide downwards and never otherwise, the objection would be to a great extent valid. But what is there to prevent those doors to be fitted so as to move upwards, or horizontally, or slantwise? In which case they would go through the obstructing layer of coal as easily as a knife goes through butter. Anyone may convince himself of it by experimenting with a light piece of board and a heap of stones anywhere along our roads. Probably the joint of such a door would weep a little, and there is no necessity for it being hermetically tight, but the object of converting bunkers into spaces of safety would be attained. You may take my word for it that this could be done without any great effort of ingenuity, and that is why I have qualified the expert's objection as inane. Of course, these doors must not be operated from the bridge because of the risk of trapping the coal trimmers inside the bunker, but on the signal of all other watertight doors in the ship being closed, as would be done in case of a collision, they too could be closed on the order of the engineer of the watch, who would see to the safety of the trimmers. If the rent in the ship's side were within the bunker itself, that would become manifest enough without any signal, and the rush of water into the stokehold could be cut off directly the door-plate came into its place, say a minute at the very outside. Naturally, if the blow of a right-angled collision, for instance, were heavy enough to smash through the inner bulkhead of the bunker, why, there would be then nothing to do but for the stokers and trimmers and everybody in there to clear out of the stokeroom. But that does not mean that the precaution of having watertight doors to the bunkers is useless, superfluous, or impossible. And talking of stokeholds, firemen and trimmers, men whose heavy labour has not a single redeeming feature, which is unhealthy, uninspiring, arduous, without the reward of personal pride in it, sheer, hard, brutalizing toil, belonging neither to earth nor sea, I greet with joy the advent, for marine purposes, of the internal combustion engine. The disappearance of the marine boiler will be a real progress, which anybody in sympathy with his kind must welcome. Instead of the unthrifty, unruly, nondescript crowd the boilers require, a crowd of men in the ship but not of her, we shall have comparatively small crews of disciplined, intelligent workers, able to steer the ship, handle anchors, man boats, and at the same time competent to take their place at a bench as fitters and repairers, the resourceful and skilled seamen, mechanics of the future, the legitimate successors of these seamen, sailors of the past, who had their own kind of skill, hardihood and tradition, and whose last days it has been my lot to share. One lives and learns and hears very surprising things that one hardly knows how to take, whether seriously or jocularly, how to meet, with indignation or with contempt. Things said by solemn experts, by exalted directors, by glorified ticket sellers, by officials of all sorts. I suppose that one of the uses of such an inquiry is to give such people enough rope to hang themselves with, and I hope that some of them won't neglect to do so. One of them declared 2 days ago that there was nothing to learn from the catastrophe of the Titanic, that he had been giving his best consideration to certain rules for 10 years, and had come to the conclusion that nothing ever happened at sea, and that rules and regulations, boats and sailors were unnecessary, that what was really wrong with the Titanic was that she carried too many boats. No, I'm not joking. If you don't believe me, pray look back through the reports, and you will find it all there. I don't recollect the official's name, but it ought to have been Pooh Bah. Well, Pooh Bah said all these things, and when asked whether he really meant it, intimated his readiness to give the subject more of his best consideration, for another 10 years or so apparently. But he believed, oh yes, he was certain, that had there been fewer boats there would have been more people saved. Really, when reading the report of this admirably conducted inquiry, one isn't certain at times whether it is an admirable inquiry or a felicitous opera bouffe of the Gilbertian type, with a rather grim subject, to be sure. Yes, rather grim, but the comic treatment never fails. My readers will remember that in the number of the English Review for May 1912 I quoted the old case of the Arizona, and went on from that to prophesy the coming of a new seamanship, in a spirit of irony far removed from fun, at the call of the sublime builders of unsinkable ships. I thought that, as a small boy of my acquaintance says, I was doing a sarcasm, and regarded it as a rather wild sort of sarcasm at that. Well, I am blessed, excuse the vulgarism, if a witness has not turned up who seems to have been inspired by the same thought, and evidently longs in his heart for the advent of the new seamanship. He is an expert, of course, and I rather believe he's the same gentleman who did not see his way to fit watertight doors to bunkers. With ludicrous earnestness he assured the committee of his intense belief that had only the Titanic struck end on, she would have come into port all right. And in the whole tone of his insistent statement there was suggested the regret that the officer in charge, who is dead now, and mercifully outside the comic scope of this inquiry, was so ill-advised as to try to pass clear of the ice. Thus my sarcastic prophecy that such a suggestion was sure to turn up receives an unexpected fulfilment. You will see yet that in deference to the demands of progress, the theory of the new seamanship will become established. Whatever you see in front of you, ram it fair. The new seamanship. Looks simple, doesn't it? But it will be a very exact art indeed. The proper handling of an unsinkable ship, you see, will demand that she should be made to hit the iceberg very accurately with her nose, because should you perchance scrape the buff of the bow instead, she may, without ceasing to be as unsinkable as before, find her way to the bottom. I congratulate the future transatlantic passengers on the news and vigorous sensation in store for them. They shall go bounding across from iceberg to iceberg at 25 knots with precision and safety, and a cheerful bumpy sound, as the immortal poem has it. It will be a teeth-loosening, exhilarating experience. The decorations will be Louis Quinze, of course, and the cafe shall remain open all night. But what about the priceless Sèvres porcelain and the Venetian glass provided for the service of transatlantic passengers? Well, I am afraid all that will have to be replaced by silver goblets and plates. Nasty, common, cheap silver. But those who go to sea must be prepared to put up with a certain amount of hardship. And there shall be no boats. Why should there be no boats? Because Pooh Bah has said that the fewer the boats, the more people can be saved, and therefore with no boats at all, no one need be lost. But even if there was a flaw in this argument, pray look at the other advantages the absence of boats gives you. There can't be the annoyance of having to go into them in the middle of the night, and the unpleasantness, after saving your life by the skin of your teeth, of being hauled over the coals by irreproachable members of the bar with hints that you are no better than a cowardly scoundrel and your wife a heartless monster. Less boats. No boats. Great should be the gratitude of passage-selling combines to Pooh Bah. They ought to cherish his memory when he dies. But no fear of that. His kind never dies. All you have to do, O Combine, is to knock at the door of the Marine Department, look in and beckon to the first man you see. That will be he, very much at your service, prepared to affirm, after 10 years of my best consideration and a bundle of statistics in hand, that there's no lesson to be learned and there is nothing to be done. On an earlier day there was another witness before the Court of Inquiry, a mighty official of the White Star Line. The impression of his testimony, which the report gave, is of an almost scornful impatience with all this fuss and pother. Boats! Of course we have crowded our decks with them in answer to this ignorant clamour. Mere lumber! How can we handle so many boats with our davits? Your people don't know the conditions of the problem. We have given these matters our best consideration, and we have done what we thought reasonable. We have done more than our duty. We are wise and good and impeccable, and whoever says otherwise is either ignorant or wicked." This is the gist of these scornful answers, which disclose the psychology of commercial undertakings. It is the same psychology which 50 or so years ago, before Samuel Plimsoll uplifted his voice, sent overloaded ships to sea. Why shouldn't we cram in as much cargo as our ships will hold? Look how very few of them get lost, after all. Men don't change, not very much. And the only answer to be given to this manager, who came out, impatient and indignant, from behind the plate-glass window of his shop to be discovered by this inquiry, and to tell us that they, the whole 3 million, or 30 million for all I know, capital organisations for selling passages, has considered the problem of boats, the only answer to give him is that this is not a problem of boats at all. It is the problem of decent behaviour. If you can't carry or handle so many boats, then don't cram quite so many people on board. It is as simple as that, this problem of right feeling and right conduct, the real nature of which seems beyond the comprehension of ticket providers. Don't sell so many tickets, my virtuous dignitary. After all, men and women, unless considered from a purely commercial point of view, are not exactly the cattle of the Western Ocean trade that used some 20 years ago to be thrown overboard on an emergency and left to swim round and round before they sank. If you can't get more boats, then sell less tickets. Don't drown so many people on the finest, calmest night that was ever known in the North Atlantic, even if you have provided them with a little music to get drowned by. Sell less tickets. That's the solution of the problem, your mercantile highness. But there would be a cry, "Oh, this requires consideration." 10 years of it, eh? Well, no, this does not require consideration. This is the very first thing to do. At once. Limit the number of people by the boats you can handle. That's honesty. And then you may go on fumbling for years about these precious davits which are such a stumbling block to your humanity, these fascinating patent davits, these davits that refuse to do 3 times as much work as they were meant to do. Oh, the wickedness of these davits! One of the greatest discoveries of this admirable inquiry is the fascination of the davits. All these people positively can't get away from them. They shuffle about and groan about their davits. Whereas the obvious thing to do is to eliminate the man-handled davits altogether. Don't you think that with all the mechanical contrivances, with all the generated power on board these ships, it is about time to get rid of the 100-year-old manpower appliances? Cranes are what is wanted. Low, compact cranes with adjustable heads, one to each set of 6 or 9 boats. And if people tell you of insuperable difficulties, if they tell you of the swing and spin of spanned boats, don't you believe them? The heads of the cranes need not be any higher than the heads of the davits. The lift required would be only a couple of inches. As to the spin, there is a way to prevent that if you have in each boat 2 men who know what they are about. I've taken up on board a heavy ship's boat in the open sea, the ship rolling heavily, with a common cargo derrick. And a cargo derrick is very much like a crane, but a crane devised ad hoc would be infinitely easier to work. We must remember that the loss of this ship has altered the moral atmosphere. As long as the Titanic is remembered, an ugly rush for the boats may be feared in case of some accident. You can't hope to drill into perfect discipline a casual mob of 600 firemen and waiters, but in a ship like the Titanic you can keep on a permanent, trustworthy crew of 100 intelligent seamen and mechanics who would know their stations for abandoning ship and would do the work efficiently. The boats could be lowered with sufficient dispatch. One does not want to let rip one's boats by the run all at the same time. With 6 boat cranes, 6 boats would be simultaneously swung, filled, and got away from the side, and if any sort of order is kept, the ship could be cleared of the passengers in a quite short time. For there must be boats enough for the passengers and crew, whether you increase the number of boats or limit the number of passengers, irrespective of the size of the ship. That is the only honest course. Any other would be rather worse than putting sand in the sugar, for which a tradesman gets fined or imprisoned. Do not let us take a romantic view of the so-called progress. A company selling passengers as a tradesman, though from the way these people talk and behave you would think they are benefactors of mankind in some mysterious way, engaged in some lofty and amazing enterprise. All these boats should have a motor engine in them. And of course the glorified tradesman, the mummified official, the technicians and all these secretly disconcerted hangers-on to the enormous ticket-selling enterprise will raise objections to it with every air of superiority. But don't believe them. Doesn't it strike you as absurd that in this age of mechanical propulsion, of generated power, the boats of such ultra-modern ships are fitted with oars and sails, implements more than 3,000 years old? Old as the siege of Troy, older. And I know what I'm talking about. Only 6 weeks ago I was on the river in an ancient, rough ship's boat fitted with a 2-cylinder motor engine of 7.5 horsepower. Just a common ship's boat, which the man who owns her uses for taking the workmen and stevedores to and from the ships, loading at the buoys off Greenhithe. She would have carried some 30 people. No doubt has carried as many daily for many months. And she can tow a 25-ton water barge, which is also part of that man's business. It was a boisterous day, half a gale of wind against the flood tide. 2 fellows managed her. A youngster of 17 was Cox, and a first-rate Cox he was too. A fellow in a torn blue jersey, not much older, of the usual riverside type, looked after the engine. I spent an hour and a half in her, running up and down and across that reach. She handled perfectly. With 8 or 12 oars out, she could not have done anything like as well. These 2 youngsters, at my request, kept her stationary for 10 minutes, with a touch of engine and helm now and then, within 3 feet of a big ugly mooring buoy over which the water broke and the spray flew in sheets, and which would have holed her if she had bumped against it. But she kept her position, it seemed to me, to an inch, without apparently any trouble to these boys. You could not have done it with oars. And her engine did not take up the space of 3 men, even on the assumption that you would pack people as tight as sardines in a box. Not the room of 3 people, I tell you. But no one would want to pack a boat like a sardine box. There must be room enough to handle the oars. But in that old ship's boat, even if she had been desperately overcrowded, there was power, manageable by 2 riverside youngsters, to get away quickly from a ship's side. Very important for your safety and to make room for other boats, the power to keep her easily head to sea, the power to move at 5 to 7 knots towards a rescuing ship, the power to come safely alongside, and all that in an engine which did not take up the room of 3 people. A poor boatman who had to scrape together painfully the few sovereigns of the price had the idea of putting that engine into his boat. But all these designers, directors, managers, constructors and others whom we may include in the generic name of Yampsy never thought of it for the boats of the biggest tank on earth, or rather on sea. And therefore they assume an air of impatient superiority and make objections, however sick at heart they may be. And I hope they are, at least as much as a grocer who has sold a tin of imperfect salmon which destroyed only 6 people. And you know, the tinning of salmon was progress, as much at least as the building of the Titanic. More, in fact. I am not attacking ship owners. I care neither more nor less for lines, companies, combines, and generally for trade arrayed in purple and fine linen than the trade cares for me. But I am attacking foolish arrogance, which is fair game, the offensive posture of superiority by which they hide the sense of their guilt, while the echoes of the miserably hypocritical cries along the alleyways of that ship, "Any more women? Any more women?" linger yet in our ears. I have been expecting from one or the other of them all bearing the generic name of Yampsy something, a sign of some sort, some sincere utterance in the course of this admirable inquiry, of manly, of genuine compunction. In vain. All trade talk. Not a whisper, except for the conventional expression of regret at the beginning of the yearly report, which otherwise is a cheerful document. Dividends, you know. The shop is doing well. And the admirable inquiry goes on, punctuated by idiotic laughter, by paid-for cries of indignation from under legal wigs, bringing to light the psychology of various commercial characters too stupid to know that they are giving themselves away, an admirably laborious inquiry into facts that speak, nay, shout for themselves. I am not a soft-headed humanitarian faddist. I have been ordered in my time to do dangerous work. I have ordered others to do dangerous work. I have never ordered a man to do any work I was not prepared to do myself. I attach no exaggerated value to human life, but I know it has a value for which the most generous contributions to the Mansion House and Heroes Fund cannot pay. And they cannot pay for it because people, even of the third class, excuse my plain speaking, are not cattle. Death has its sting. If Yamsey's manager's head were forcibly held under the water of his bath for some little time, he would soon discover that it has. Some people can only learn from that sort of experience which comes home to their own dear selves. I am not a sentimentalist, therefore it is not a great consolation to me to see all these people brevetted as heroes by the penny and halfpenny press. It is no consolation at all. In extremity, in the worst extremity, the majority of people, even of common people, will behave decently. It's a fact of which only the journalists don't seem aware. Hence their enthusiasm, I suppose. But I, who am not a sentimentalist, think it would have been finer if the band of the Titanic had been quietly saved instead of being drowned while playing whatever tune they were playing, the poor devils. I would rather they had been saved to support their families than to see their families supported by the magnificent generosity of the subscribers. I am not consoled by the false, written-up, Drury Lane aspects of that event, which is neither drama, nor melodrama, nor tragedy, but the exposure of arrogant folly. There is nothing more heroic in being drowned very much against your will off a holed, helpless big tank in which you bought your passage than in dying of colic caused by the imperfect salmon in the tin you bought from your grocer. And that's the truth. The unsentimental truth, stripped of the romantic garment the press has wrapped around this most unnecessary disaster. End of Certain Aspects of the Admirable Inquiry into the Loss of the Titanic, 1912. Protection of Ocean Liners, 1914, in Notes on Life and Letters by Joseph Conrad. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Dann. Notes on Life and Letters. Protection of Ocean Liners, 1914. The loss of the Empress of Ireland awakens feelings somewhat different from those the sinking of the Titanic had called up on two continents. The grief for the lost and the sympathy for the survivors and the bereaved are the same, but there is not, and there cannot be, the same undercurrent of indignation. The good ship that is gone, I remember reading of her launch something like 8 years ago, had not been issued in with beat of drum as the chief wonder of the world of waters. The company who owned her had no agents, authorized or unauthorized, giving boastful interviews about her unsinkability to newspaper reporters, ready to swallow any sort of trade statement, if only sensational enough for their readers as ignorant as themselves as to the nature of all things outside the commonest experience of the man in the street. No, there was nothing of that in her case. The company was content to have as fine, staunch, seaworthy a ship as the technical knowledge of that time could make her. In fact, she was as safe a ship as 999 ships out of any 1,000 now afloat upon the sea. No, whatever sorrow one can feel, one does not feel indignation. This was not an accident of a very boastful marine transportation. This was a real casualty of the sea. The indignation of the New South Wales Premier flashed telegraphically to Canada is perfectly uncalled for. That statesman, whose sympathy for poor mates and seamen is so suspect to me that I wouldn't take it at 50% discount, does not seem to know that a British Court of Marine Inquiry, ordinary or extraordinary, is not a contrivance for catching scapegoats. I, who have been a seaman, mate and master for 20 years, holding my certificate under the Board of Trade, may safely say that none of us ever felt in danger of unfair treatment from a court of inquiry. It is a perfectly impartial tribunal which has never punished seamen for the faults of ship owners, as indeed it could not do even if it wanted to. And there is another thing the angry Premier of New South Wales does not know. It is this, that for a ship to float for 15 minutes after receiving such a blow by a bare stem on her bare side is not so bad. She took a tremendous list, which made the minutes of grace vouchsafed her of not much use for the saving of lives. But for that neither her owners nor her officers are responsible. It would have been wonderful if she had not listed with such a hole in her side. Even the Aquitania with such an opening in her outer hull would be bound to take a list. I don't say this with the intention of disparaging this latest triumph of marine architecture, to use the consecrated phrase. The Aquitania is a magnificent ship. I believe she would bear her people unscathed through 90% of all possible accidents of the sea. But suppose a collision out on the ocean involving damage as extensive as this one was, and suppose then a gale of wind coming on. Even the Aquitania would not be quite seaworthy, for she would not be manageable. We have been accustoming ourselves to put our trust in material, technical skill, invention, and scientific contrivances to such an extent that we have come at last to believe that with these things we can overcome the immortal gods themselves. Hence, when a disaster like this happens, there arises, beside the shock to our humane sentiments, a feeling of irritation, such as the honourable gentleman at the head of the New South Wales Government has discharged in a telegraphic flash upon the world. But it is no use being angry and trying to hang a threat of penal servitude over the heads of the directors of shipping companies. You can't get the better of the immortal gods by the mere power of material contrivances. There will be neither scapegoats in this matter, nor yet penal servitude for anyone. The directors of the Canadian Pacific Railway Company did not sell safety at sea to the people on board the Empress of Ireland. They never in the slightest degree pretended to do so. What they did was to sell them a sea passage, giving very good value for the money, nothing more. As long as men will travel on the water, the sea gods will take their toll. They will catch good seamen napping, or confuse their judgment by arts well known to those who go to sea, or overcome them by the sheer brutality of elemental forces. It seems to me that the resentful sea gods never do sleep, and are never weary, wherein the seamen who are mere mortals condemned to unending vigilance are no match for them. And yet it is right that the responsibility should be fixed. It is the fate of men that even in their contest with the immortal gods they must render an account of their conduct. Life at sea is the life in which, simple as it is, you can't afford to make mistakes. With whom the mistake lies here is not for me to say. I see that Sir Thomas Shaughnessy has expressed his opinion of Captain Kendall's absolute innocence. This statement, premature as it is, does him honour, for I don't suppose for a moment that the thought of the material issue involved in the verdict of the Court of Inquiry influenced him in the least. I don't suppose that he is more impressed by the writ of $2 million nailed, or more likely pasted, to the foremast of the Norwegian than I am, who don't believe that the Storstad is worth 2 million shillings. This is merely a move of commercial law, and even the whole majesty of the British Empire, so finely invoked by the sheriff, cannot squeeze more than a very moderate quantity of blood out of a stone. Sir Thomas, in his confident pronouncement, stands loyally by a loyal and distinguished servant of his company. This thing has to be investigated yet, and it is not proper for me to express my opinion, though I have one, in this place and at this time. But I need not conceal my sympathy with the vehement protestations of Captain Anderson. A charge of neglect and indifference in the matter of saving lives is the cruellest blow that can be aimed at the character of a seaman worthy of the name. On the face of the facts as known up to now, the change does not seem to be true. If upwards of 300 people have been, as stated in the last reports, saved by the Storstad, then that ship must have been at hand and rendering all the assistance in her power. As to the point which must come up for the decision of the Court of Inquiry, it is as fine as a hair. The two ships saw each other plainly enough before the fog closed on them. No one can question Captain Kendall's prudence. He has been as prudent as ever he could be. There is not a shadow of doubt as to that. But there is this question. Accepting the position of the two ships when they saw each other as correctly described in the very latest newspaper reports, It seems clear that it was the Empress of Ireland's duty to keep clear of the collier, and what the court will have to decide is whether the stopping of the liner was, under the circumstances, the best way of keeping her clear of the other ship, which had the right to proceed cautiously on an unchanged course. This, reduced to its simplest expression, is the question which the court will have to decide. And now, apart from all problems of manoeuvring, of rules of the road, of the judgment of men in command, away from their possible errors and from the points the court will have to decide, if we ask ourselves what it was that was needed to avert this disaster, costing so many lives, spreading so much sorrow, and to a certain point shocking the public conscience, if we ask that question, what is the answer to be? I hardly dare set it down. Yes, what was it that was needed? What ingenious combination of shipbuilding? What transverse bulkheads? What skill? What genius? How much expense in money and trained thinking? What learned contriving to avert that disaster? To save that ship, all these lives, so much anguish for the dying and so much grief for the bereaved, all that was needed in this particular case in the way of science, money, ingenuity and seamanship was a man and a cork fender. Yes, a man, a quartermaster, an able seaman that would know how to jump to an order and was not an excitable fool. In my time at sea there was no lack of men in British ships who could jump to an order and were not excitable fools. As to the so-called cork fender, it is a sort of soft balloon made from a net of thick rope, rather more than a foot in diameter. It is such a long time since I have indented for cork fenders that I don't remember how much these things cost apiece. One of them, hung judiciously over the side at the end of its lanyard by a man who knew what he was about, might perhaps have saved from destruction the ship and upwards of 1,000 lives. 2 men with a heavy rope fender would have been better, but even the other one might have made all the difference between a very damaging accident and downright disaster. By the time the cork fender had been squeezed between the liner's side and the bluff of the Storstad's bow, the effect of the latter's reversed propeller would have been produced, and the ships would have come apart with no more damage than bulged or started plates. Wasn't there lying about on that liner's bridge, fitted with all sorts of scientific contrivances, a couple of simple and effective cork fenders, or on board of that Norwegian either? There must have been, since one ship was just out of dock or harbour and the other just arriving. That is the time, if ever, when cork fenders are lying about a ship's decks. And there was plenty of time to use them, and exactly in the conditions in which such fenders are effectively used. The water was as smooth as in any dock. One ship was motionless, the other just moving at what may be called dock speed when entering, leaving, or shifting berths. And from the moment the collision was seen to be unavoidable till the actual contact, a whole minute elapsed. A minute! An age under the circumstances. And no one thought of the homely expedient of dropping a simple, unpretending rope fender between the destructive stern and the defenceless side. I appeal confidently to all the seamen in the still united kingdom, from His Majesty the King, who has been really at sea, to the youngest intelligent A.B. in any ship that will dock next tide in the ports of this realm, whether there was not a chance there. I have followed the sea for more than 20 years. I have seen collisions. I have been involved in a collision myself, and I do believe that in the case under consideration this little thing would have made all that enormous difference, the difference between considerable damage and an appalling disaster. Many letters have been written to the press on the subject of collisions. I have seen some. They contain many suggestions, valuable and otherwise, but there is only one which hits the nail on the head. It is a letter to the Times from a retired captain of the Royal Navy. It is printed in small type, but it deserved to be printed in letters of gold and crimson. The writer suggests that all steamers should be obliged by law to carry hung over their stern what we at sea call a pudding. This solution of the problem is as wonderful in its simplicity as the celebrated trick of Columbus's egg, and infinitely more useful to mankind. A pudding is a thing something like a bolster of stout rope net, stuffed with old junk, but thicker in the middle than at the ends. It can be seen on almost every tug working in our docks. It is, in fact, a fixed rope fender, always in a position where presumably it would do most good. Had the Storstad carried such a pudding proportionate to her size, say 2 feet diameter in the thickest part, across her stern, and hung above the level of her hose-pipes, there would have been an accident, certainly, and some repair work for the nearest shipyard, but there would have been no loss of life to deplore. It seems almost too simple to be true, but I assure you that the statement is as true as anything can be. We shall see whether the lesson will be taken to heart. We shall see. There is a commission of learned men sitting to consider the subject of saving life at sea. They are discussing bulkheads, boats, davits, manning, navigation, but I am willing to bet that not one of them has thought of the humble pudding. They can make what rules they like. We shall see if, with that disaster calling aloud to them, they will make the rule that every steamship should carry a permanent fender across her stern, from 2 to 4 feet in diameter in its thickest part, in proportion to the size of the ship. But perhaps they may think the thing too rough and unsightly for this scientific and aesthetic age. It certainly won't look very pretty, but I make bold to say it will save more lives at sea than any amount of the Marconi installations which are being forced on the shipowners on that very ground, the safety of lives at sea. We shall see. To the editor of the Daily Express. Sir, as I fully expected, this morning's post brought me not a few letters on the subject of that article of mine in the Illustrated London News, and they are very much what I expected them to be. I shall address my reply to Captain Littlehales, since obviously he can speak with authority, and speaks in his own name, not under a pseudonym, and also for the reason that it is no use talking to men who tell you to shut your head for a confounded fool. They are not likely to listen to you. But if there be in Liverpool anybody not too angry to listen, I want to assure him or them that my exclamatory line, "Was there no one on board either of these ships to think of dropping a fender, etc., was not uttered in the spirit of blame for anyone. I would not dream of blaming a seaman for doing, or omitting to do, anything a person sitting in a perfectly safe and unsinkable study may think of. All my sympathy goes to the 2 captains, much the greater share of it to Captain Kendall, who has lost his ship and whose load of responsibility was so much heavier. I may not know a great deal, but I know how anxious and perplexing are those nearly end-on approaches, so infinitely more trying to the men in charge than a frank right-angle crossing. I may begin by reminding Captain Littlehales that I, as well as himself, have had to form my opinion, or rather my vision, of the accident from printed statements, of which many must have been loose and inexact, and none could have been minutely circumstantial. I have read the reports of the Times and the Daily Telegraph, and no others. What stands in the columns of these papers is responsible for my conclusion, or perhaps for the state of my feelings when I wrote the Illustrated London News article. From these sober and unsensational reports, I derived the impression that this collision was a collision of the slowest sort. I take it, of course, that both the men in charge speak the strictest truth as to preliminary facts. We know that the Empress of Ireland was for a time lying motionless, and if the captain of the Storstad stopped his engines directly the fog came on, as he says he did, then taking into account the adverse current of the river, the Storstad, by the time the 2 ships sighted each other again, must have been barely moving over the ground. The over-the-ground speed is the only one that matters in this discussion. In fact, I represented it to myself as just creeping on ahead, no more. This, I contend, is an imaginative view, and we can form no other, not utterly absurd for a seaman to adopt. So much for the imaginative view of the sad occurrence which caused me to speak of the fender, and be chided for it in unmeasured terms. Not by Captain Littlehales, however, and I wish to reply to what he says with all possible deference. His illustration, borrowed from boxing, is very apt, and in a certain sense makes for my contention. Yes, a blow delivered with a boxing glove will draw blood or knock a man out, but it would not crush in his nose flat or break his jaw for him, at least not always. And this is exactly my point. Twice in my sea life I've had occasion to be impressed by the preserving effect of a fender. Once I was myself the man who dropped it over, not because I was so very clever or smart, but simply because I happened to be at hand. And I agree with Captain Littlehales that to see a steamer's stern coming at you at the rate of only 2 knots is a staggering experience. The thing seems to have power enough behind it to cut half through the terrestrial globe. And perhaps Captain Littlehales is right. It may be that I am mistaken in my appreciation of circumstances and possibilities in this case, or in any such case. Perhaps what was really wanted there was an extraordinary man and an extraordinary fender. I care nothing if possibly my deep feeling has betrayed me into something which some people call absurdity. Absurd was the word applied to the proposal for carrying enough boats for all on board the big liners. And my absurdity can affect no lives, break no bones, need make no one angry. Why should I care then, as long as out of the discussion of my absurdity there will emerge the acceptance of the suggestion of Captain F. Papillon, R.N., for the universal and compulsory fitting of very heavy collision fenders on the stems of all mechanically propelled ships? An extraordinary man we cannot always get from heaven on order, but an extraordinary fender that will do its work is well within the power of a committee of old boatswains to plan out, make, and place in position. I beg to ask, not in a provocative spirit, but simply as to a matter of fact, which he is better qualified to judge than I am. Will Captain Littlehales affirm that if the Storstad had carried, slung securely across the stem, even nothing thicker than a single bale of wool, an ordinary hand-pressed Australian wool bale, it would have made no difference? If scientific men can invent an air cushion, a gas cushion, or even an electricity cushion, with wires or without, to fit neatly round the stems and bows of ships, then let them go to work in God's name and produce another marvel of science without loss of time. For something like this has long been due, too long for the credit of that part of mankind which is not absurd, and in which I include, among others, such people as marine underwriters, for instance. Meanwhile, turning to materials I am familiar with, I would put my trust in canvas, lots of big rope, and in large, very large quantities of old junk. It sounds awfully primitive, but if it will mitigate the mischief in only 50% of cases, is it not well worth trying? Most collisions occur at slow speeds, and it ought to be remembered that in case of a big liner's loss, involving many lives, she is generally sunk by a ship much smaller than herself. Joseph Conrad. End of Protection of Ocean Liners, 1914. A Friendly Place, 1914, in Notes on Life and Letters by Joseph Conrad. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Peter Dann. Notes on Life and Letters, A Friendly Place, 1914. 18 years have passed since I last set foot in the London Sailors' Home. I was not staying there then. I had gone in to try to find a man I wanted to see. He was one of those able seamen who, in a watch, are a perfect blessing to a young officer. I could perhaps remember here and there among the shadows of my sea life a more daring man, or a more agile man, or a man more expert in some special branch of his calling, such as wire splicing, for instance. But for all-round competence he was unequalled. As character he was sterling stuff. His name was Anderson. He had a fine, quiet face, kindly eyes, and a voice which matched that something attractive in the whole man. Though he looked yet in the prime of life, shoulders, chest, limbs untouched by decay, and though his hair and moustache were only iron grey, he was on board ship generally called Old Andy by his fellows. He accepted the name with some complacency. I made my inquiry at the highly glazed entry office. The clerk on duty opened an enormous ledger, and after running his finger down a page, informed me that Anderson had gone to sea a week before in a ship bound round the Horn. Then, smiling at me, he added, "Old Andy, we know him well here. What a nice fellow." I, who knew what a good man in a sailor sense he was, assented without reserve. Heaven only knows when, if ever, he came back from that voyage to the Sailors' Home of which he was a faithful client. I went out glad to know he was safely at sea, but sorry not to have seen him, though indeed if I had we would not have exchanged more than a score of words perhaps. He was not a talkative man, old Andy, whose affectionate ship name clung to him even in that sailors' home, where the staff understood and liked the sailors, those men without a home, and did its duty by them with an unobtrusive tact, with a patient and humorous sense of their idiosyncrasies, to which I hasten to testify now, when the very existence of that institution is menaced after so many years of most useful work. Walking away from it on that day 18 years ago, I was far from thinking it was for the last time. Great changes have come since, over land and sea, and if I were to seek somebody who knew old Andy, it would be, of all people in the world, Mr. John Galsworthy. For Mr. John Galsworthy, Andy and myself have been shipmates together in our different stations for some 40 days in the Indian Ocean in the early 90s. And, but for us two, old Andy's very memory would be gone from this changing earth. Yes, things have changed. The very sky, the atmosphere, the light of judgment which falls on the labours of men, either splendid or obscure. Having been asked to say a word to the public on behalf of the Sailors' Home, I felt immensely flattered and troubled. Flattered to have been thought of in that connection, troubled to find myself in touch again with that past so deeply rooted in my heart. And the illusion of nearness is so great while I trace these lines that I feel as if I was speaking in the name of that worthy sailor shade of old Andy, whose faithfully hard life seems to my vision a thing of yesterday. But though the past keeps firm hold on one, yet one feels with the same warmth that the men and the institutions of today have their merit and their claims. Others will know how to set forth before the public the merit of the Sailors' Home in the eloquent terms of hard facts and some few figures. For myself, I can only bring a personal note, give a glimpse of the human side of the good work for sailors ashore, carried on through so many decades with a perfect understanding of the end in view. I have been in touch with the Sailors' Home for 16 years of my life, off and on. I have seen the changes in the staff, and I have observed the subtle alterations in the physiognomy of that stream of sailors passing through it, in from the sea and out again to sea, between the years 1878 and 1894. I have listened to the talk on the decks of ships in all latitudes, when its name would turn up frequently, and if I had to characterize its good work in one sentence, I would say that, for seamen, the Wells Street Home was a friendly place. It was, essentially, just that, quietly, unobtrusively, with a regard for the independence of the men who sought its shelter ashore, and with no ulterior aims beyond that effective friendliness. No small merit, this. And its claim on the generosity of the public is derived from a long record of valuable public service. Since we are all agreed that the men of the merchant service are a national asset worthy of care and sympathy, the public could express this sympathy no better than by enabling the Sailors' Home, so useful in the past, to continue its friendly offices to the seamen of future generations. End of A Friendly Place, 1914. End of Notes on Life and Letters by Joseph Conrad.